My first memories of my daddy's cedar chopping days start around 1944, 45. We went with my daddy's uncle Dewey Shannon and his family, and my daddy's great uncle L. Priest, to a location on Sandy Creek here in Williamson County. The men were all cutting cedar, and Uncle L was making it into charcoal. And I remember seeing the coal kiln. And the cedar that wasn't made into charcoal was hauled to the cedar yard and sold. We lived in a big tent, and I saw the coal kiln that Uncle L let the women and kids see. And I remember when the charcoal was ready and the men bagged it up to take it into Austin, that there would be some tiny pieces left, and us kids would get them and write on the rocks. I wasn't old enough to go to school, so I didn't know how to write, but I copied the other kids' marks. And we lived there in the spring and summertime because I remember it was warm weather. In the fall of 1945, my daddy took a job as a mechanic at a service station and garage until my mother had her third child. When he was born, then we went to stay with my grandparents, John and Ida Guest, somewhere near Mountain Home. And my grandfather had a job on a ranch supervising the ranch hands, and we lived with them. And during this time, my daddy long hauled cedar from Mac Callahan. And I remember seeing the big truck he drove, and I thought it was the biggest thing I'd ever seen in my life. And then one of my daddy's Shannon cousins came by to see him and told him that the Moe Ranch near Hunt, Texas was hiring cedar choppers to clear the cedar off of the ranch, and said you could camp out on the ranch. So off we went to Hunt, Texas. I remember that we went in the winter, and the first night we spent the night at my dad's cousin's tent, and the tent leaked, and I was cold all night. The next day, my daddy and his cousin went to the ranch owner and asked him if we could run the goats out of the goat shed and live in the goat shed until it got warmer weather. He agreed, and my daddy sprinkled kerosene inside and lit a little fire to burn out and kill all the pests inside. And we kids thought it would burn the place down, but it didn't. My daddy must have known what he was doing. So we lived in the goat shed until spring. And I remember my dad getting up at daylight and leaving and not getting home till dark. And when it got warmer weather, we moved into tents near the creek. And I have a fond memory of my daddy filing his axe every night, so it would be really sharp the next day for him to use. And same as usual, he always got up and left right at daylight and didn't come home until right at dark. During the years between 1946 and 50, about approximately, we moved constantly because my daddy thought the next place would be better. My guest grandparents had moved back to Austin, Texas, and during this time we lived in Lakey and in Campwood and Austin various times. My mother's fourth child was born in Austin when my daddy was working various manual labor jobs, but he didn't like that. He wanted to chop cedar. I didn't like it during this time because I had to change schools so much. But in 1950, we lived in Lakey, and my mother's fifth child was born. We lived in town, and Daddy cut cedar on a nearby ranch. During this time, he also worked at a checker at my granddad Dick Boatright's cedar yard. And he let my 7- and 5-year-old brothers drive his Burma Jeep truck in the cedar yard. And people thought that was amazing. But in 1952, we lived in Utopia outside the city limits near the old cemetery there. And my daddy cut cedar on a nearby ranch. And my mother's sixth child was born at the hospital in Uvalde, and her birth certificate lists my daddy's occupation as cedar chopper. What I remember most of all from the cedar chopping days was how hard the choppers worked and how they were always fixing flat tires and working on their old trucks. We moved back to Austin when I was in the 9th grade, moved to Lakey again, and for 5 months we lived there, and then my mother insisted that we move back to Austin. And that put an end to my daddy's cedar chopping days. My daddy, Cleo Victor Guest, was the only cedar chopper in his family. His father, John Wesley Guest, grew up on his grandfather's ranch. His grandfather, James Leggett Marshall, applied for a land grant from the state of Texas and received land on the Colorado River. They forded the river across the Tech area, and the ford was named Marshall Ford after James Marshall. My grandfather, John Guest, married Ida Shannon from the Shannon cedar choppers. My dad learned to chop cedar from his Shannon uncles and cousins, and these Shannons were basically all over the Texas Hill Country, and we went along with them. I remember that in the towns of Campwood, Lakey, and Utopia, my daddy could go to one of the small grocery stores and tell the owner whose ranch he was cutting cedar on and where he lived, and they would give him credit at the store, and he could charge stuff and then pay for it either at the end of the week or the end of the month. Another thing I remember is that everybody worked on their trucks and fixed flats on Sunday. They helped each other fix their old worn out trucks.